I was 29 when my paycheck crossed a number I used to say out loud like a fantasy. I remember the moment because I was sitting in my car in the office parking lot, engine running, rain tapping the windshield, staring at the deposit alert on my phone. I smiled for a full minute. I had grown up in a house where money was discussed in whispers, arguments, and grocery math, so seeing that number felt bigger than a raise. It felt like proof that I had outrun the life I came from. Back then, that was my definition of progress. More income meant a better life. A better life meant I was winning. I did not have a more thoughtful framework than that. I had salary, bonus, debt, and the gap between what came in and what went out. As long as the first number kept rising, I assumed everything else was improving too. It felt practical. It felt adult. It also felt good to be the guy who picked up the check without looking at the menu twice. The job rewarded that mindset. I worked in operations, and I was good with pressure. I could stay calm while other people panicked, and I could untangle a mess fast enough that nobody above me had to feel it for long. Managers noticed. Promotions followed. Every raise felt like a scoreboard lighting up. I started buying things I used to call one-day purchases. A better watch, a newer truck, seats close enough to the court that you could hear the sneakers. None of it was reckless. That made it easier to justify. The first crack came quietly at the kitchen table. I was answering email while my wife sorted school forms and bills. She asked, "Are you happy?" Not proud, not grateful. Happy. I laughed because the question felt vague to me. I pointed to the bills and said, "We're doing great." She looked at me and said, "That's not what I asked." I didn't know what to do with that, so I went back to typing. A week later, I got another compliment from my boss in the hallway and carried it home like a trophy. I remember standing in the garage with the door half open, still in my work clothes, telling myself this was what growth looked like. The weird part is I already felt restless, even while I was proud. I was making more and tightening up inside at the same time. I didn't have the language for that yet, so I called it drive and kept going. That habit of renaming discomfort would carry me for years, and it got expensive. What I believed then was that income would eventually build the life I wanted if I kept increasing it. What I understand now is that income can improve your options without improving your direction. Even then, sitting in that parked car and at that kitchen table, I had already started confusing a bigger number with a better life. By 33, my life looked impressive in all the ways people recognize quickly. Bigger house, better neighborhood, nicer title, cleaner clothes, a driveway that made my father nod when he visited. I left the house before sunrise most days and came home after dark, but I told myself that was the price of momentum. I called it a season. Every hard week was temporary. Every sacrifice was strategic. If I could just keep the income climbing, I told myself, the rest of life would settle down later. The problem was that later kept moving. At work, I became the first call when something went wrong. I was fast, steady, and hard to rattle, and I wore that like armor. I loved being the dependable one. I told younger guys to know their value and push for more, and part of that advice was good. The part I missed was what it was doing to me. I had built my identity around earning more, and almost none of it around becoming better. I was more productive, more efficient, and more expensive to replace. I was not more present. At home, our conversations started sounding like budget meetings. We talked about rates, repairs, school costs, tax planning, and what we could upgrade next. Necessary things, sure, but my wife stopped bringing me ideas that couldn't be measured. She stopped suggesting we drive nowhere on a Saturday. She stopped asking if we could invite friends over on short notice. I always had a reason to delay life until I hit the next financial milestone. After bonus season, after the quarter, after this project. Each raise bought me relief for a week or two, then became normal. The higher paycheck became the baseline. The pressure stayed. In some ways, it got worse because now my identity was attached to maintaining a certain standard. It wasn't just income anymore. It was image. It was proof. It was the thing I pointed to when I didn't want to ask harder questions. One night I sat in the driveway after work with the engine off and the house lights on, watching my family through the front window before I went inside. I told myself I was taking a minute to decompress, but really I was trying to switch roles and didn't know how. Work had become the place where I felt clear and competent, and home had started to feel like another place I was behind. That scared me enough to notice it, but not enough to change it. Then the company changed around me, and I responded the only way I knew. I could feel the tension building, but I kept calling it discipline because that sounded stronger than doubt. What I believed then was that the next income jump would make everything lighter. What I understand now is that income solves real problems, but it cannot answer questions it was never designed to answer. It can fund a life. It cannot tell you whether you're actually living it yet. The year I turned 38, the company announced a restructuring, and I reacted the way I always reacted to uncertainty. I tried to become more valuable. I volunteered for the ugliest transition work, took over a team nobody wanted, and started working weekends before anyone asked me to. I told myself I was protecting my family. Some of that was true. Layoffs were real, and I had seen what happened when targets slipped. But fear and ego were mixed together in me by then, and I could not tell where one ended and the other began. That was the year my income jumped the most. It was also the year I slept the worst. I started waking up around 3 a.m. with my mind already sorting numbers before my feet hit the floor. Staffing, freight, contracts, delays. I kept a notepad on the nightstand because I convinced myself writing things down would help me rest. It didn't. It just made my anxiety look organized. During the day, I still performed well, which made it easy to hide. I was functioning, earning, and getting praised. I was also exhausted. One Saturday, my son asked if I could help him build a shelf for his room. It was one of those cheap flat-pack sets with too many screws and bad instructions. I said yes, and meant it. We planned for after breakfast. Then a client called. Then a budget issue hit. Then 3 quick emails, each turned into a half hour. By the time I came upstairs, he and my wife had already built it. It leaned a little to the left, and he was proud of it. I patted the top and said, "Looks good, buddy," like I was signing off on a task. The next Monday, I got a retention bonus, a number I would have celebrated a few years earlier. I stared at it and felt almost nothing. That flatness scared me more than the stress. I had spent years chasing numbers like that, and now I was too tired to feel them. A few days after the shelf incident, I walked past my son's room and saw that crooked shelf holding his trophies and a picture of the 2 of us from years earlier. It stopped me in the hallway. The shelf worked fine. It was my absence that felt bent. I stood there longer than I should have, then went downstairs and opened my laptop anyway. That was the patterns. Moments of clarity followed by more work. I was still trying to solve a life problem with an income strategy, and it followed me right onto the vacation we had planned. What I believed then was that protecting my income was the same as protecting my family. What I understand now is that money can protect your household while your habits quietly damage the people inside it. I wasn't failing because I earned too much. I was failing because income had become my only scoreboard. The illusion finally broke on a vacation I had paid for in full and barely experienced. We took the kids to the coast for 4 days in early summer. Nice hotel, ocean view, the exact kind of trip I used to promise myself I would provide once I made it. On paper, it was the reward all that work was supposed to buy. I brought my laptop anyway. I told everyone I just needed to stay reachable. By the second day, I had turned the little desk in the room into a temporary office and was checking messages between beach trips. One afternoon, I stood on the balcony while they walked on the beach below me. My wife near the water, my daughter hopping away from the edge of the waves, my son carrying a towel over one shoulder like he was trying on being older. They looked like a family on vacation. I looked like the guy financing it from above. That image hit me harder than I expected because it showed me exactly what I had been doing for years. I thought paying for the moment was the same thing as participating in it. That night, my wife and I argued quietly in the hallway because the kids were asleep. She didn't yell. She was too tired for yelling. She just said, "You keep acting like if you pay for something, you've participated in it." I started listing responsibilities the way I always did: deadlines, clients, pressure. She let me finish and said, "I know you work hard. I'm talking about the way you disappear while standing right next to us." I can still hear that sentence. When we got home, I did what I always did after a hard truth. I worked more, but something had shifted. I started noticing how often I used money to avoid looking at myself. If I felt guilty, I bought something. If I felt absent, I planned a bigger trip. If I felt behind, I pushed for more income. I was using financial wins to cover emotional deficits, and it worked just well enough to keep me from changing. The ride home from that trip was quiet, in the way family cars get quiet when everyone is tired and nobody wants another argument. I drove, listened to the highway hum, and replayed my wife's sentence in my head. I could feel two versions of myself fighting, the one who wanted to defend everything and the one who knew she was right. I didn't change overnight, but that drive planted something. By the time the bags were unpacked, I knew the issue was bigger than stress. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I knew the next chapter of my life would not be solved by another raise. What I believed then was that income proved growth. What I understand now is that growth without reflection can look a lot like expensive avoidance. That vacation was supposed to be a reward. It became a mirror instead. And once I saw myself in it, I couldn't unsee it. The first real change I made was so small it almost felt embarrassing. I didn't quit my job. I didn't sell the house. I didn't announce a new philosophy. One Sunday morning, while the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote a question at the top. What do I mean by progress? I expected practical answers: security, savings, options. Instead, what came out was different. Sleep through the night, eat dinner without my phone, laugh more at home, stop feeling irritated by small things. None of those things were on a performance review. None of them showed up in a bonus. That was the point, and it landed hard. I had let work define progress for me because work could measure it, and I was good at measurable things. It was harder to measure patience, presence, honesty, and attention, so I kept my life organized around what got counted. Seeing that in my own handwriting was the first time I realized how narrow my definition had become. I started small because big declarations would have been another kind of performance. First, I stopped checking email in bed. Then I stopped bringing my laptop to the dinner table. Then I picked one evening a week when I was not reachable unless the building was literally on fire. The first few times I did it, I felt anxious and guilty, like I was violating some contract. Nothing collapsed. Problems waited. Other adults handled things. That part stung because I had built a lot of identity around being the one who saved the day. At work, I started saying no to projects that looked good on paper, but cost too much in practice. I still worked hard. I still cared, but I stopped volunteering for every fire simply because I knew I could put it out. I delegated more. I let people own outcomes. I stopped rescuing people at midnight and calling it leadership. My team got stronger when I stopped overfunctioning for everyone. One Tuesday evening, after I left my phone on the counter on purpose, I sat at the table while my son told a long story about a teacher and a spilled drink and a joke that only made sense to him. Normally, I would have rushed him to the point. That night, I just listened. Nothing dramatic happened, but I felt the room differently. I noticed how tense I usually was and how much effort it took to stay still. That was the turn. I could see the next phase would be built from repetition, not speeches. It also made the next changes harder because repetition is less dramatic than ambition and much less flattering to your ego. What I believed then was that reducing my availability would stall my career and threaten my income. What I understand now is that some of my high performance was just overwork wrapped in praise. The hidden cost wasn't only stress, it was identity. I had built a self-image around carrying too much, and setting it down felt scary before it felt free. The rebuilding phase was quieter than the burnout phase, which made it easy to underestimate. There was no dramatic speech and no single conversation that fixed everything. It was repetition. I came home and put my phone on the counter. I sat through dinner without checking it. I asked my son about school and waited for the long answer instead of the short one. I sat on the patio with my wife and listened without trying to solve every sentence. It was ordinary work, but ordinary work repeated long enough started changing the feel of our house. At the office, once income stopped being my only scoreboard, I started seeing trade-offs clearly. Some opportunities still looked good on paper. Bigger title, more travel, more visibility, more money. A few years earlier, I would have said yes before the conversation ended. Now I looked at the hours, the stress, and the version of myself those roles would require, and I passed on a few of them. People noticed. One colleague asked if I'd lost my ambition. I told him no. I had finally decided ambition needed a destination, not just velocity. That didn't mean money stopped mattering. Income mattered a lot. It gave our family breathing room. It reduced fear in our house. It paid for repairs, school, and choices we didn't have before. I'm grateful for every raise I earned. The mistake was never wanting more. The mistake was treating more money like automatic proof that I was becoming more whole. Those are different questions, and I spent years answering one while neglecting the other. The biggest proof that things were changing came from my daughter. She was home from college one weekend and asked if I wanted to get coffee and drive around for a while. Years earlier, I would have said yes and brought my phone and half my attention. This time, I left my phone on the kitchen counter by accident, realized it halfway down the road, and kept driving. We talked for an hour about classes, a professor she loved, and a boy I didn't trust yet. Nothing dramatic happened. It was ordinary. It was perfect. There were setbacks, too. I still had weeks where I slipped and answered messages I didn't need to answer. The difference was I noticed it in real time instead of calling it normal. Naming the reflex didn't erase it, but it gave me a choice, and those choices started changing me faster than the raises had. That was when I started trusting small changes more than big promises, because small changes were the only ones I was actually living. It felt less exciting than chasing promotions, but it was the first time my daily life started matching what I said I valued. What I believed then was that progress had to be visible to count. What I understand now is that some of the most important progress in a life looks small from the outside. Better sleep, fewer interruptions, more patience, less performing, more presence. Nobody applauds that at work, but those changes gave me my life back. By 50, I was still doing well financially, but money no longer worked as a mirror. It was a tool. I still tracked spending, negotiated, planned for retirement, and handled all the unromantic responsibilities of adulthood. The difference was that I stopped looking at an income increase and assuming it answered every other question in my life. I learned slowly and with more collateral damage than I like admitting that numbers can tell you what you earn. They can't tell you whether you are at peace. That shift made me better at work, not worse. I was steadier, less reactive, less hungry for proof. I could walk into a tense meeting and think about outcomes instead of status. I could hear criticism without turning it into a threat to my identity. I could mentor younger managers without secretly using them as mirrors for my own ambition. A few of them asked what mattered most for getting ahead, and I started giving them the answer I wish someone had forced on me earlier. Define what ahead means before you chase it. I also started seeing the same confusion in people around me, men my age with bigger houses and shorter tempers, younger managers already exhausted and calling it discipline, families on expensive trips where everybody looked at separate screens. It's an easy trap because visible wins get rewarded loudly. Pay raises get applause, promotions get announced, better boundaries usually don't. Presence doesn't. You can be praised for years while your real life gets thinner, and if no one asks the right question, you can mistake applause for alignment. I don't say any of this with bitterness. Regret? Yes. There are seasons with my kids I can't redo. There are nights my wife sat across from me while I was physically home and mentally somewhere else. I can't erase those years. I can tell the truth about them, and the truth matters. One afternoon, a younger manager came into my office, shut the door, and told me he was making good money and feeling miserable. He laughed when he said it, the same way I used to laugh when someone asked a real question. I didn't give him a speech. I asked him what his definition of progress was, and he went quiet. That silence told me everything. It also reminded me why this story matters. He sat there for a while, staring at the carpet, and I recognized that look too. He asked me what I did about it, and I told him the truth. I started by changing what I measured, then changed what I protected. He nodded slowly, and I did too. What I believed then was that if the numbers went up, my life must be improving. What I understand now is that progress is a wider question. Am I easier to live with, more at peace, and building a life I actually want to inhabit? Income belongs in that conversation, but it should never be allowed to run it. I'm older now, and I don't judge the younger version of me the way I used to. He was trying to outrun fear. He wanted stability, respect, and a life that didn't feel fragile. Those were not shallow goals. The problem was never wanting money. The problem was the shortcut in my thinking. Because money solved some real pain, I assumed more money would solve all of it. That idea kept me busy for years, and busy is a convenient place to hide when your life looks good from the outside. If someone younger asks me what to focus on now, I still tell them to earn well and negotiate hard. Learn valuable skills. Don't apologize for wanting security. But I also tell them to build a second scoreboard early before the bills get bigger and the habits set. Track your relationships, track your health, track your attention, track whether you can sit through dinner without reaching for your phone. Track whether the people in your house feel calmer when you walk in or tighter. Those numbers are harder to measure, but they tell the truth faster. A few months ago, I found the old legal pad page where I first wrote my new definition of progress. The paper was folded and stained, and the handwriting was sloppier than I remembered. Sleep through the night, eat dinner without my phone, laugh more at home. My grandson was at the kitchen table coloring while I stood there reading it, and I realized most of the things that saved my life did not increase my income at all. They increased my ability to enjoy the life my income helped build. That difference sounds small until you feel it. I still care about money. I always will. I plan. I work. I pay attention. I just don't ask income to tell me who I am anymore. That's too much weight to put on a number. Some years it rises. Some years it doesn't. Progress has to be bigger than that, or your peace will always be rented from circumstances you can't control. Last week I was in the kitchen early, sunlight coming through the window, coffee in my hand, while my grandson argued with his crayons at the table. My phone buzzed in the other room, and I let it buzz. That tiny choice would have sounded meaningless to the old version of me. Now I know it is the whole point. A life is built in those moments. And the funny thing is, those moments now feel bigger than most of the milestones I used to chase. What I believed then was that a higher paycheck meant I was moving forward. What I understand now is that progress is when your life becomes more coherent, not just more expensive. When what you value and how you live finally start matching. When the people closest to you feel your success as presence, not just purchases. That lesson cost me years, but learning it changed everything that mattered.